My husband's family secret was buried in the foundation of our new home, and they would have killed to keep it there. The first crack in our marriage appeared not as a fissure in trust, but as a literal hairline fracture in the freshly poured concrete of our basement floor. It was a tiny, dark line, snaking its way from the corner where the cold, cinder-block wall met the gray, still-damp slab. I noticed it only because I was on my hands and knees, wiping a smudge of paint I'd dropped while touching up the baseboards upstairs. The smell of the basement was a peculiar mix of wet cement, damp earth, and the sharp tang of the new PVC pipes we just had installed. This was supposed to be the final phase of the renovation, the unglamorous but necessary work that would turn this damp hollow into a usable space, a laundry room, maybe a home gym one day. Now it felt like a grave. We had been married for exactly 37 days. A blissful, frantic month that felt both like an eternity and the blink of an eye. Our wedding was a small, perfect affair at the courthouse, just after 10 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. The sun had been sharp and clear through the tall windows of the chamber. I wore a simple cream-colored dress. Mark wore a navy suit that brought out the blue in his eyes. My parents held hands, beaming. His parents, Robert and Carol, stood stiffly but proudly, while his sister Sarah sniffled into a tissue, her husband John patting her back. Afterward, we all went to the Oak Room, a quiet, old-fashioned restaurant with dark wood and soft lighting, for a luncheon. We ate roast chicken and talked about the weather, our jobs, the future. It was normal. It was everything I ever wanted. The house was the physical manifestation of that future. A sturdy but weary-looking two-story colonial on a quarter-acre lot at the edge of town. It needed work. A lot of it. But Mark, ever the optimist, saw potential in every squeaky floorboard and patch of faded wallpaper. "We can make this ours, Lily," he'd said, his arm around me as we stood in the empty living room on our first walkthrough. "Every nail we hammer, every wall we paint, it'll be ours." I was 24, an associate graphic designer with a steady but not extravagant income. Mark, 26, was a project manager at a small tech firm. We'd been together for 3 years and 9 months, having gotten engaged the previous December under a blanket of stars during a weekend trip to the mountains. The purchase of the house, a monumental step, felt like the natural progression of our carefully built love. Mark's family was deeply embedded in the process from the start. Robert, a retired general contractor, saw the house not as a home but as a project to be conquered. He arrived on our first day of ownership with a toolbox the size of a small suitcase and a critical eye. "Load-bearing wall here," he'd grunted, tapping a partition. "You can't take this out. These pipes are galvanized steel. They'll need replacing within 5 years." His advice was offered not as suggestion but as decree. Carol, a woman whose life was organized into color-coded binders, took charge of the scheduling, coordinating deliveries of drywall and flooring with an efficiency that was both impressive and intimidating. Sarah and John were the muscle, showing up on weekends to help with demolition and hauling. I was grateful initially. My own parents lived a 3-hour drive away and their help, while loving, was sporadic. Mark's family was a built-in, relentless renovation crew. But there was an intensity to their involvement that sometimes felt smothering. It was their way, their methods, their timeline. My suggestions about open shelving in the kitchen or a skylight in the master bedroom were met with polite smiles and then dismissed by Robert as impractical or a structural nightmare. The basement was Robert's particular obsession. It was an unfinished, damp space with a dirt floor, typical for houses of that era. I was happy to leave it for last, focusing our energy and limited budget on the living spaces above. But Robert was adamant. "You seal the floor now before the first frost," he'd insisted during a family dinner at their impeccably clean home. "Otherwise, the moisture comes up, ruins everything you put down here later. It's a weekend job. I'll get the concrete at a discount. We'll all pitch in." Mark, who revered his father's professional opinion, agreed immediately. I felt a twinge of unease. The basement felt like the one part of the house that was still truly ours, untouched by their influence. But I pushed the feeling down. It was just a concrete floor. What could possibly go wrong? The day of the pour dawned gray and humid, the air thick with the promise of a late summer storm. The concrete truck arrived at 7 a.m., its giant drum rotating with a low, grinding rumble that shook the quiet street. Robert directed the driver with sharp hand signals, the thick, gray slurry snaking its way down a chute and into the basement through a window well we'd temporarily converted into a hatch. Mark and John, dressed in old jeans and boots, were inside with shovels and rakes, spreading the concrete. The air filled with the alkaline, chalky smell of wet cement. My job was the finishing. Once the concrete was roughly level, I was to use a long-handled magnesium float to smooth the surface. It was harder than it looked, requiring a steady, gentle pressure. The heat and humidity were oppressive even underground. Sweat dripped down my temples and pooled at the small of my back. Carol and Sarah were upstairs, preparing a lunch of cold cuts and potato salad, their voices a muffled chatter from above. I was working my way from the back wall towards the stairs, my muscles aching when the edge of my float caught on something. I thought it was a large stone that had been mixed into the aggregate. I tried to push past it, but it was stubborn. Annoyed, I leaned down, squinting in the dim light from the bare bulb hanging from a joist. Protruding from the gray muck was not a stone, but a corner of something dark blue and frayed. Denim. Must be a rag that fell in, I called out to Mark, who was taking a water break by the stairs. He shrugged. Just pull it out. I gripped the fibrous material and tugged. It didn't budge. I planted my feet and pulled harder, putting my back into it. With a wet, sucking sound, the concrete reluctantly released its hold. What emerged was not a rag but a torn section of a blue jeans leg. And attached to that leg, emerging from the concrete like a ghastly fossil, was a human foot, skeletal and pale, still laced inside a rotting leather work boot, caked with dried mud and flecks of gravel. The world slowed. The sound of the rotating truck drum outside became a distant hum. I stared, my brain refusing to process the image. A foot. A human foot. In my basement. Buried in the dirt where we were now pouring concrete. A scream tore from my throat, a raw, primal sound I didn't recognize as my own. I stumbled backward, my boots slipping in the wet concrete, and landed hard on my backside, the impact jarring my teeth. I scrambled away crab-like, my hands sinking into the unforgiving wet grayness, unable to take my eyes off the ghastly appendage pointing accusingly at the ceiling. The commotion brought everyone running. Mark was the first to reach me, his face a mask of confusion that quickly morphed into horror as his eyes followed my trembling finger. He let out a choked "What the?" before his words failed him. But it was the reaction of his parents that sealed the moment in ice. Robert, who had been supervising the truck driver upstairs, clattered down the steps. He took in the scene in a single sweeping glance. Me on the floor, covered in concrete, Mark's ashen face, and the foot. His own face, usually ruddy with health and authority, drained of all color, leaving a waxy, gray pallor. He didn't gasp. He didn't cry out. His jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitch in his cheek. Carol, who had followed him down, let out a sharp, stifled cry. Her hand flew to her mouth, but her eyes were wide with a terror that was not fresh but ancient, recognized. It was the look of someone seeing a ghost they had long prayed would stay buried. In that fraction of a second, a silent, frantic message passed between husband and wife. It was a look of pure, undiluted panic, a shared secret screaming to be contained. Sarah started to wail, a high-pitched hysterical sound that echoed in the cramped space. "Oh my God! Oh my God! What is that?" But her performance felt hollow, her eyes darting between her parents, seeking direction. John stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, his mouth agape, his face a blank slate of shock. "Call 911. Mark finally shouted, his voice cracking. He stumbled towards me, pulling me to my feet, away from the nightmarish sight. My whole body was shaking uncontrollably. The police arrived, then the paramedics, and our dream home was transformed into a cordoned-off crime scene. Yellow tape was stretched across the basement stairs, a vibrant, cruel barrier between our new life and the horror festering beneath it. The body, once carefully excavated by forensic anthropologists, was identified through dental records as Michael Grady. He had been 22 years old when he vanished a decade ago. The cold case file was thin. A local kid, a landscaper by trade, known for a quick temper and a fondness for beer. He'd last been seen leaving a bar on the outskirts of town. The investigation had led nowhere. Until we decided to pour a concrete floor. In the days that followed, the family's carefully constructed facade began to splinter. The police questioned all of us separately for hours. I told them everything I could, which was nothing about Michael Grady. I was 14 when he disappeared, obsessed with boys and pop music, my world confined to school and my suburban neighborhood. Mark had been away at his first year of college. But the detective's interest zeroed in on Robert. He had owned the adjacent plot of land for years, a overgrown lot he used for storing construction materials. He had sold it to us for a fraction of its market value, a wedding gift that now felt like a way to keep the land under family control. Mark was crumbling under the pressure. His fatal flaw, one I had witnessed before but never in a context this dire, was his inability to hold his tongue under stress. He was a compulsive secret sharer, not out of malice, but from a neurological need to fill anxious silences with sound, to seek validation or reassurance through disclosure. In the past year, he told a coworker about another's planned resignation before the person could announce it. He'd let slip my best friend's early pregnancy news to her boyfriend. Now his anxiety was a bubbling geyser. One evening, about a week after the discovery, we were sitting amidst a sea of half-unpacked moving boxes in our living room. The house, once filled with the promise of a new beginning, now felt like a gilded cage. Mark was on his third beer, his eyes glassy and fixed on the blank television screen. "Why, Dad, he's not sleeping," Mark mumbled, his words slightly slurred. "He's yelling at Mom. He never yells. He told me I should stop being so helpful to the cops." A cold knot tightened in my stomach. "Helpful how, Mark? What have you been telling them?" He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Nothing. Just stuff. That Dad knew the guy. Michael Grady. He did some work for my parents back when I was in high school. Built a new retaining wall in the backyard. There was a problem with it. Dad said the foundation was shoddy, that it would collapse. He refused to pay the full amount. They had a huge argument right there in the driveway. Dad threatened to sue him. Grady threatened. Well, he threatened to come back and finish the job himself." I stared at him, my breath caught in my throat. "Mark, that's not nothing. That's a motive. Why would you tell them that without talking to me first?" "Because it doesn't mean anything," he insisted, his voice rising defensively. "It was a business dispute. People have arguments all the time. It doesn't mean my father is a murderer." The word hung in the air between us, ugly and final. The next day, Detective Evans, a calm, methodical man with tired eyes, paid us another visit. He confirmed what I feared. "Your husband has been very cooperative," he said, choosing his words carefully. "The information about the financial dispute and the threats is significant. It establishes a direct link and a potential motive between Mr. Grady and your father-in-law." I felt a wave of nausea. Mark, in his anxious need to be perceived as helpful, had inadvertently built a case against his own father. But my mind kept returning to that look between Robert and Carol. It wasn't the look of people hiding a business dispute. It was the look of people hiding a cataclysm. The fracture in our reality became a chasm when Sarah showed up at our door unannounced 2 days later. Her face was puffy, her eyes wild. She brushed past me without a greeting, her perfume a cloying cloud in the tense air of our hallway. "You have to get him to stop," she demanded, whirling around to face me in the living room. "Stop what, Sarah?" "Mark. He's making it worse. He's talking too much, trying to explain things he doesn't understand. He's going to ruin everything. She was wringing her hands, a nervous, twisting motion I'd never seen her use before. Ruin what, Sarah? I asked, my voice low and steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. The carefully constructed story? The truth. She looked at me with a mixture of contempt and a desperate, pleading fear. You don't get it, Lily. You just married in. This family, we protect our own. No matter what. What happened, it was a terrible, terrible accident. The air in the room seemed to thin. Accident. The word was a key turning in a lock, opening a door to a truth I had already sensed but dreaded facing. Who, Sarah? I pressed, my voice barely a whisper. Who had the accident? She shook her head, fresh tears spilling over. It doesn't matter. Don't you see? It was 10 years ago. We were all there that night. We all decided what to do. We had to protect the family. That's all that matters. We were all there. We all decided. The mosaic of horror was now complete. It wasn't just Robert. It was Carol. It was Sarah. It was likely John. A collective act. A family conspiracy to hide a death. They had buried the body on their property, and years later Robert had sold us the land, never imagining our renovation would dig so deep. When Mark came home, I relayed the conversation verbatim. Instead of the shock and revulsion I expected, he retreated into defensiveness. She's hysterical, he said, pacing the length of the kitchen. She doesn't know what she's saying. You can't take that to the police. It's just her word against everything. Mark, a man was beaten to death and buried. Your entire family knows about it. And you're worried about her word. And what do you want me to do? He shouted, slamming his hand on the counter, making me jump. Destroy my family? Send my parents to prison for the rest of their lives? Ruin Sarah's life? For what? For something that happened a decade ago. The argument was cut short by the ringing of his phone. It was Carol. Her voice, tinny through the speaker, was strained but controlled. He wanted a family meeting. At their house. That night. We need to be united on this, Mark, she said. We need to get our story straight. Mark agreed instantly, a drowning man grasping for a lifeline. I refused to go. The silence after he left was heavier than any I had ever known. I walked down to the basement, stopping at the yellow tape. The hole in the floor was a dark, raw wound in the gray concrete. The smell of damp earth and death seemed to have seeped into the very walls. This was to be the foundation of our life together. A tomb. Mark returned late, his shoulders slumped, the smell of whiskey on his breath. He collapsed into an armchair, not looking at me. Well? I finally asked, the word cracking in the silence. He spoke to the floor. They have a story. They're all agreed. They're going to tell the police that Michael Grady came to the house that night, drunk and angry about the money. He and my dad argued. He took a swing, lost his balance, and fell, hitting his head on the corner of the stone hearth. He died instantly. They panicked. They thought no one would believe it was an accident, not with the threat hanging over them. So, Robert and Carol buried him. Alone. Sarah and John knew later, but they weren't involved. I listened, my blood running cold. It was a plausible story. Clean. Neat. An accident followed by a catastrophic error in judgment. But it was a lie. I could feel it. And you believe that? After what Sarah said about, we all decided? What does it matter what I believe? He cried, his voice breaking. It's the story. It's the only story that keeps this family from being torn apart. We have to stick to it. He was choosing them. He was choosing the lie. The pressure to conform, to forgive this monstrous secret for the sake of family peace, was an immense, suffocating weight. They wanted to absolve themselves with a unified narrative, to welcome me into the fold of their conspiracy with a Sunday dinner. The next morning I found a thick, cream-colored envelope that had been slipped under our front door. The stationery was expensive, the handwriting Carol's elegant, looping script. Dearest Lily, we know this is an unimaginable shock and a terrible burden. We are all reeling. But remember, we are family now. What binds us, love, loyalty, shared history, is stronger than this old tragedy. For the sake of our family's future, for your marriage to our son, we must present a united front. Forgiveness is the only path to true peace. Please come to dinner on Sunday. We will talk as a family and heal together. I showed it to Mark. He read it and a strange calm settled over his features. Maybe she's right, he said softly, almost to himself. Maybe this is the only way forward. We just accept it and move on. That was the moment I knew I had lost him. The man I married was gone, replaced by a boy terrified of his father's shadow, willing to live in a house of lies to keep the peace. I couldn't do it. I couldn't breathe in that atmosphere of deceit. I drove to the police station and asked for Detective Evans. I handed him Carol's note. I told him everything. The look of recognition, Sarah's confession of a collective accident, the pressure to conform, my husband's capitulation. I told him I believed the family's unified story was a carefully constructed lie. The fallout was swift and brutal. The police brought Robert and Carol back in, confronting them with the inconsistencies. They brought Sarah in separately, and without her parents to guide her, her resolve cracked. In exchange for immunity, she told a different story. It was John, her then-boyfriend, who had been at the house that night. He and Robert had been drinking with Michael Grady. The argument over money escalated. John, a hothead with a jealous streak, Sarah confessed he'd always been possessive, flew into a rage. He didn't push Grady. He picked up a heavy metal tire iron from Robert's toolbox and struck him again and again. It wasn't an accident. It was a brutal, frenzied murder. Robert and Carol had walked in on the aftermath. To protect their daughter's future, to avoid the scandal, they had made a choice. They helped John dispose of the body. Sarah, a terrified teenager, was forced into the secret. John was arrested for second-degree murder. Robert and Carol were charged as accessories after the fact and for obstruction of justice. The truth was far more monstrous than the accident they had concocted. Mark was utterly destroyed. The foundation of his identity was annihilated. He came to me hollow-eyed and trembling. "You were right," he choked out, tears streaming down his face. "I was so wrong. I was such a coward. I chose the lie because the truth was too terrible to face." We are still in the house. The basement remains unfinished, a silent, gaping reminder. We are in intensive counseling, trying to navigate the wreckage of our marriage and his shattered family. He has cut off contact with his parents, who blame me for manipulating Sarah into confessing. He wants nothing to do with Sarah, whom he sees as a weak accomplice and the source of the lie that nearly consumed us. The family that demanded forgiveness now sits in jail cells or awaits trial, their unity exposed as a fragile shield for a horrible crime. I keep a detailed log of everything: the note, the text messages, the police case number, the court documents. I changed my phone number. We installed a top-of-the-line security system. They call me a traitor, a snake who betrayed the family that welcomed me. But I am not the one who betrayed this family. I simply refused to live in the tomb they had built for us, to let their secret become the cornerstone of my marriage. The body in the basement was their shame. But the choice to step out of the shadows and into the harsh, unforgiving light of the truth, that was mine. And I would make it again.